Our scriptural reading today is from Matthew 20, 1 through 16. And I was reading through this, practicing this, and it just clicked in me. The first sentence, because I've always thought that, well, that's not fair. And then the first sentence jumped out at me, so keep the first sentence in mind. For the kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went out. For the kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went out early in the morning to hire his laborers for his vineyard. After agreeing with the laborers for a denarius for the day, he sent them into his vineyard. When he went out about 9 o'clock, he saw others standing idle in the marketplace, and he said to them, "You also go into the vineyard, and I will pay you whatever is right." So they went. When he went again at noon and about 3 o'clock, he did the same. And about 5 o'clock, he went out and found others standing around, and he said to them, "Why are you standing here idle all day?" They said to him, "Because no one has hired us." He said to them, "You also go into the vineyard." When evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his manager, "Call the laborers and give them their pay, beginning with the last of them, going to the first." When those hired about 5 o'clock came, each of them received a denarius. Now when the first came, they thought they would receive more, but each of them also received a denarius. And when they received it, they began grumbling against the landowner, saying, "These last worked only an hour, and you have made them equal to us, who have been borne of the burden of the day and the scorching heat." But he replied to one of them, "Friend, I am doing no wrong. Did you not agree to work for me for a denarius? Take what belongs to you and go. I choose to give to the last the same as I give to you. Am I not allowed to do what I choose with what belongs to me? Are you so envious because I am generous? So the last will be first, and the first will be last."
Jerome Berryman, who wrote one of the standard books about children in worship, says parables are like a gift. And so a few years, somebody gave me a gift, and this became my parable box. But he says parables are like a gift. We don't ask for it, we just get it. We can't give it back, and often it is exactly what we need. Parables are special gifts because they are given from Jesus to his disciples, and often they have special meaning. And as I looked in this today, I noticed I had coins, which evidently I needed to talk about money this week. But as we said, parables are gifts that are given to the church. This one is found only in the Gospel of Matthew, which makes sense because the Gospel of Matthew, if we were going to go through the four Gospels, we can tell the Gospel of Matthew was kind of written by a country boy or girl. It is very rural in its setting. It talks about kind of the different ways in which the earth, the agricultural cycle, is part of the people of Israel. In fact, Carl Jacobson, who is my old Hebrew teacher, who I had him in class 21 years ago, and it turns out he actually wrote the commentary that is for this week's reading. And he says that there are many takes with this unique parable. He says probably the one you don't want to use this parable for, that was kind of mentioned earlier, is you don't want to use this to run a business. It is definitely a parable of the kingdom of God. But he says there are many different takes from this. Sometimes it is hard to understand, but the Spirit will give us some understanding as we look at our parables. But this week, as Labor Day approaches and the motorcycles fill our town, and thank you for the ushers for closing the door, or else you would have just heard nothing but vroom, 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 vroom the entire time I was up here. But we have kind of a story that is long on kind of the ordinary part of life. The first 7 verses of this are very ordinary country life. We have a landowner who is going out into the vineyard. It is time to harvest. I like to think that he was humming or whistling the Johnny Appleseed song. You know, some of you may have been an age where you saw that as the Disney cartoon. Some of you may have been of an age that you only know that because that's the song you sing for grace, usually when you go to camp. But the landowner in this story, he bargains with the workers, and they get a pretty generous deal. A denarius is basically kind of 3 days worth of labor, For 1 day of working out in the field, they're essentially getting paid for 3 days. He is evidently very adamant about getting the harvest in today. And so we see that this is kind of a great deal for them. So he sends those folks, those go-getters, the bargainers, out into the field. Now, the harvest is always a busy time of year, so the landowner, I suppose, stopped by the shop to get a wagon wheel or something, and the shops are opening at 9 o'clock, and you can see that there are people still out there, and so he goes to them and he says, I will do right by you, go out and work in my field. And he does this again. I imagine he had to pick up some more baskets, or maybe he had to sharp some pruning hooks. And he goes hour after hour, and he says the same thing: get out into my field, I'll pay you what is right. In fact, those of you who are more literary-minded will kind of think of, perhaps you have read Far from the Maddening Crowd or heard of Thomas Hardy. And there's this great scene that kind of explains why there's always these workers sitting out there in the marketplace. And there's a great scene in which the protagonist goes into town. He has just lost his kind of herd of sheep. He has just lost everything, and so he has to hire himself out, and he wants to be a bailiff or a manager. And everyone at that time, when he goes there dressed as like a bailiff or a manager, they want to hire shepherds. And so after about midday, he goes back, he finds his old shepherd's crook, he dresses as a guy who's looking for a shepherd's job, and he goes in the afternoon, and all they want to do are hire managers and bailiffs. Now, the end of the day, and also in that story, he does kind of have a happy ending, but towards the end of the day, we see the landowner, and he's kind of maybe encountering people like this who had not gotten the right job. I can imagine the landowner walking in, probably still belting out the Johnny Appleseed song. And the landowner comes over, and he's probably there to get the payroll. And he spots folks that have been there, and it's still 5 o'clock in the afternoon. And these people have been praying all day to work. And now the landowner is not there because someone has given him revised labor statistics. But he simply just runs into them and asks them why they are here and why are they in idle. It is a good harvest. And they are downhearted. And he kind of sees, and they explain that they have been looking for work all day and nobody has hired them. And so finally he sends them to work in the vineyard. And we will notice in the text it is even without a promise of pay. He just sends them out. He kind of gets them for a song, and by now I guess we can imagine which song he got them for. But verse 8, at the end of the working day, is when the parable moves beyond the ordinary. It's where we are reminded of the very first verse. But he orders the managers to call the workers, and he pays them from last to first, and he pays them equally, which of course they complain. The folk who bargained well, worked over 12 hours, who started in the morning mist, in the heat of the day and into the evening, they have a point in their complaining because rightly so, this is no way to run a business. That is why it is a parable of the kingdom of heaven. But don't get too discouraged. Because we do have 2 verses in this part after verse 8 that will kind of convert your money-minded friend of yours, which we all have kind of that person who in our life who is always kind of money-oriented. Sometimes they say the phrase, this country's gone to hell since we got off the gold standard. There's somebody that always wants to talk about the Federal Reserve, or if there's something funny happening in the news you have to explain, you go to them and they explain it to you. More recently, there's kind of a new phenomena. There's kind of a bro we know that always wants to talk about Bitcoin, always wants to sell us Bitcoin. You can tell they have a lot of Bitcoin and are really interested in selling theirs. And these are usually libertarian folks, and they will definitely not let us forget it. Now, Jesus, in this parable, he goes about as kind of libertarian as he can. In the guise of the landowner who says, I paid you what you bargained for, I can do with my money what I want to do. And that's kind of something you can kind of stick in your back pocket if somebody is kind of talking about that, maybe even kind of go in the church. You know, Jesus says you can do with your money what you want to do with it. You know, that could be a selling point for some folks. But since we are on the topic of money, as a pastor who has not slipped any language about stewardship or giving for several months, by the way, you are welcome, I am required to point out that you and we can be generous in the labor of our hands and the silver in our pocketbooks, a gift for fellowship, our presence in the life of the church, and we can share other gifts even if it is only a song, and I have a particular song in mind. Kind of rocking that Johnny Appleseed thing all sermon here. But now with the generosity, sometimes we discover that other people will have a reaction to that. Sometimes it can even well up into something that is ungodly or sinful. The first and most subtle version of what we see from this are actually from the laborers in the marketplace. You know, kind of those who had been there all day. They are envious of all those who got picked to go out into the fields. And some people really place an emphasis on being chosen, on being picked. I remember a few years ago, I was invited to a sending off, or maybe it was a graduation party. It was for a girl in our church down in Missouri. Oddly enough, she was also the harvest queen, and the harvest queen was to celebrate the harvest of the grapes in that part of Missouri. Now, the parents, of course, did kind of the classic thing when a pastor is present. So I had to say the prayer before the barbecue. And then, you know, they kind of did the one extra thing, and they kind of decided that the kids would have to share what they are thankful for. So the red-haired girl who had been the star football player, the harvest queen, she had won numerous academic scholarships to go study at the local university. She was also very outdoorsy. You know, she was kind of very good with being in camo. But the thing that she was most thankful for over the school years was being picked to go to the prom all 4 years of high school. And then she explained, it's just like, you know, there's only like, 100 boys who go to our high school and like 150 girls. So it was a big deal, as I was told. But you can kind of imagine back if we were in our scripture, the guys and girls at the marketplace, watching as everyone else had been picked that day. Crew after crew leaves to work, and there they are just kind of standing and kicking rocks. And I'll point out again that some have received promises of fair payment, some of them bargained, but they all left and went. And it must have been depressing and a feeling of worthlessness watching everyone else leave. But by the end, the others just went even without a promise from the landowner. Because if you can't be the belle at the ball, at least you can go, is maybe what they thought. Now we might say, well, come on, some of us will get picked last for something, especially in school. If you don't get picked first for kickball, then you're kind of, well, maybe you'll get picked for mathletics, which I never understood mathletics. I guess competition for math people. Of course, I'm the one guy who was like picked first for the geography bee, so I can't look down on anybody. But at the same time, you can see how some people's envy can fester, and it can turn into something much darker. We got kind of a taste of it this week in Minnesota at a Catholic church in school. It was kind of the first school shooting of the year, the very first week, and it is something that is extremely tragic. We hear the same arguments, blame the tool, the ideology. Even the victims of that vicious attack were not spared. Yet one of the common denominators of all these perpetrators of violence is a deep-seated envy. I'll repeat that again. It's a deep-seated envy. They don't like the sense of community in the black church, so they go and they destroy it. They don't like the teaching that all people are made in the image of God, so they want to deface a sacred space. They are envious of the innocence of children, be it at school or prayer, and they can shatter that. Envy can warp anyone's mind and bring out the worst depravity. Envy and covetousness are cousins. In fact, Carl Jacobson, when I was looking at his commentary, points that out in this text, that a lot of this text has to do with kind of the subtext of the commandments. The first workers in the vineyard, those who struck a good bargain, they want more than what they bargained for, but it is not theirs to be given. Carl kind of puts church folks, and I can kind of see this, and he kind of puts us in those first worker category. We want something that is not ours. And if we sometimes take this metaphor of the kingdom of heaven deeper, Carl said one of the ways we can look at this is the landowner is God. He is offering salvation. He is offering forgiveness. He is offering grace. And if we look through this lens, we begin to covet God's power to forgive and God's power to control over who is forgiven and how they are forgiven. And this is kind of one of the things in the church that has been an age-old question. It is something that people have pointed out from the very beginning. People would say, Jesus, if you knew who this woman is, you would not be doing what you're doing. Kids, you are too young, take a step back. Us disciples, we are to hear about the teachings of God. Someone may have said, why do you and your disciples hang out with sinners and tax collectors? These are ungodly people, Rabbi. But if we took a look at this earlier in the summer, we saw the prophet Jonah, and he wanted the power to unforgive the people of Nineveh. Remember that story where Jonah kind of went out to the edge of town? He pouted. He was mad that God forgave the people when just, a verse or two earlier, he was sitting there and singing and saying that God's deliverance belongs to God alone. But he could not live with the fact that God was able to give good news to people that he did not like. Now, Carl was talking about this in 2011. Little did he know this would be kind of the rage in the 2020s. We are often mad that others get salvation and mercy. Often we have heard people say, well, my folks deserve more when they get the same as everybody else. Well, this group doesn't deserve to get this because they are lazy, they are sinners, or maybe they were born on the wrong side of the track. When we talk about equality and equally standing before God, we have to realize that we are made in the image of God, and each of us have access to the gift of salvation. Real equality does not tend to be favored in human societies, even societies that are not based on kind of what they are here in our society. There's a great example of this that people in the past discovered. In the Soviet Union, when Stalin's government were building public housing, it was noted that the modern and the stylish buildings were going to the party elite. Someone pointed out in this workers' utopia that all workers are to be equal. And someone coined the phrase, well, all workers are equal, just some are more equal than others. And the story found itself into George Orwell's Animal Farm. So if you want to take a look at that, there is some wisdom there. But as we wind down, we have to remember the chorus of this parable. The last will be first, and the first shall be last. And we can see this pattern of God dealing with humanity. God's chosen king was the last person anyone would think about. The greatest example of giving to God was not King Solomon, who had been giving wealth and wisdom, but the model was a widow who gave all her might. Likewise, we are kind of in our own world. Sometimes we believe that there is to be some justice, but the justice of God sometimes looks very different. Those we believe who are supposed to be last in line are sometimes first. And sometimes the people who we think are supposed to be first in line sometimes are last. And at some level, we do not like this. We know that God is just. And that's what kind of makes this parable scandalous in Carl's eyes. He said the scandal of the evening is a settling accounts is that all were given equally. He said the scandal is the church is that often we are jealous that God's gift of forgiveness is given in equal measure, especially for people like us who tend to show up on time in the right place or have done for years. But the true scandal of this parable is it really isn't about money, is it? Well, let us take a few moments. Let us prepare to meet our God in prayer.